I'm here today with Jon Sweeney, author of a new book titled Thomas Merton, An Introduction to His Life, Teachings, and Practices. Jon is an independent scholar and award-winning writer. He's a biographer of St. Francis of Assisi and translator of his writings. And his books on Franciscan subjects have sold more than 200,000 copies. Jon is the author of more than 40 books, including The Pope Who Quit, which was optioned by HBO. He's the editor-in-chief and publisher of Pericles Press. He's appeared on CBS Saturday Morning and numerous other programs and writes regularly for America Magazine in the United States and The Tablet in the UK. Jon is married to Rabbi Michal Wohl. Their interfaith marriage has been profiled in national media. He's the father of 4 and lives in Milwaukee. So, Jon, it's really a pleasure to have you join us here today. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Ryan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
We've known each other for quite a while, but I think this is the first book interview that we've been able to do. So I really am glad to be able to connect.
I think you're right. Yes. Yeah. Thanks for.
So first, I'd love for you to talk more about your background. You've been so involved in many different aspects of publishing.
Sure. So I went to Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. Grew up as a Protestant evangelical. Started to go through some spiritual religious changes at that time that were profound and that were wrapped up a bit with discovering Thomas Merton, by the way, which we're going to come around to talking about because of my new book. And I went off to seminary thinking I was going to get my MDiv and or my PhD, and I was going to preach and I was going to teach and all that sort of thing. But what happened along the way was I fell in love with books quite specifically. So while I was in seminary, I started to manage the seminary bookstore across the street. And I ended up actually leaving seminary after a few years without a degree because I went into books and writing and publishing. So I then was a bookseller, as I mentioned, and also I then moved to Cambridge, Massachusetts with my then young wife, and I managed a bookstore in Cambridge. Then I went into publishing a couple years later because we had a child, and it felt like the right thing to do. And then I've been in publishing ever since. So my work has been wrapped up in religion and in books from the moment I hit the age of accountability.
Well, you and Steve Hanselman share a lot in common, don't you?
Well, see, you don't even know the half of it, Brian, because the bookstore that I managed in Cambridge, Massachusetts is the bookstore that was started by Steve Hanselman.
I was wondering if that might be a connection.
Vanitas Books in Central Square, Cambridge. Steve and I overlapped for about 3 or 4 weeks. When I arrived was right when he was leaving to go become the publicity manager at Harper San Francisco.
Oh my goodness, that's wild. Small world, isn't it?
That was a long time ago. That was that was December of 1991. I think if you were to confirm with Steve, I think he would say that he probably started that job, his first job in publishing, in January of 92.
Wow, that's great. Well, I was looking on Facebook before we started this interview, and you're one of the most well-connected people in the Christian publishing world. I knew that. But I noticed that on Facebook, you and I have 80 mutual friends. So what would you attribute your high degree of connectedness?
Longevity. I've been involved in social media since it began. I remember, I think it was in 2009, I wrote an article in the Christian Century called "Is Facebook Church?" And I remember feeling at the time that it was a very controversial thing to argue, that Facebook could be sort of like church for me and others. And that was a long time ago. 2009 was a long time ago. So I still have a lot of friends who probably criticize my social media presence because it still has the perception in some progressive religious circles as being a superficiality, and certainly in some conservative religious circles as well. But it's been important to me. It's been a place of connection for me. So Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, I tend to be fairly active there. And so really, in a sense, it's longevity. I think I have a lot of connections there because I've been doing it for a long time. and I pay a fair amount of attention to it.
But also, you have authored many books with different publishers, and you yourself have worked at several different publishing houses too.
Yes.
We'll see. I think, you've got a lot of great relationships, across all those different activities.
Yes. Well, see, I'm just gonna stick with my longevity answer. I have a lot of friends, and I'm grateful. I have gratitude in my heart for my friends, and I know you share some of them with me now. We were talking about a couple of them before we sort of went live. So yes, I love a whole lot of people, and I get to occasionally, see them on social media. I might like it much better when I see them in person. But yes, I've been at several publishing houses doing work. I mean, I've edited 500 or 600 authors over the years.
Wow.
And I've written a lot of books myself and a lot of articles, and I work with editors at magazines, print and online. And so I've been around a long time. I'm not that old, but I've been around a long time.
Yes, yes. So could you tell us about, a few of the books that you've written?
Sure. So you mentioned, I think in your introduction, that I wrote a book called The Pope Who Quit. And I think a lot of people got to know me as an author when that book came out, because the timing ended up being fortuitous. The book came out the year before Pope Benedict XVI did quit. And the last chapter of the book has me suggesting that a pope could quit in the future, and actually talking about signs that I had seen that would suggest that Pope Benedict had considered resignation. So then a year later, Pope Benedict quit, and I remember that morning, 6:30 in the morning, I woke up, turned on my computer, looked at the news, saw that Pope Benedict had quit in Rome. And the first thing that hit my brain was, I better shave today. Because, I immediately thought, I'll bet you I'm going to get a phone call. I'll bet you I might be on TV by the end of the day. And sure enough, by 11 a.m., I had a phone call from CBS. I was living in Chicago at the time, and I was on TV that night twice. So I shaved.
I can just imagine your phone, your text messages, your email, your social media probably all exploded that day.
Yeah, it was fun. I remember sitting in the studio at CBS in Chicago that evening for the evening news, and I remember being grilled before we went live by the interviewer saying, I want you to tell us when we go live, I want you to tell us how you knew he was going to quit. And I said, I didn't know he was going to quit. I didn't have any special knowledge. And they were very upset that was my answer, but that was my honest answer. I didn't know he was going to quit. I just sort of got lucky, I think.
Well, I would say a smart guy that had some insight, you're being too humble, but in any event.
Well, anyway, so HBO quickly optioned the film rights, and then they renewed that option for several years, which was wonderful. It was a little check I got to deposit in my checking account each year. They have now let that lapse. So I'm just putting that out there to anyone who wants to option the film rights.
Excellent.
They're available again. But anyway, that book got me sort of recognized among others. It was also published by one of the imprints at Random House, and so that didn't hurt either. But I've written most of what I've written. I mean, if you were to look at most of the books that are in the hands of people, they're books on St. Francis of Assisi. I've written several books on St. Francis, his writings, introducing him biographically, introducing him according to spiritual themes. I have my last book on St. Francis coming out this fall, actually. It's a book called Feed the Wolf that I'm very excited about. But more timely right now, what we're going to talk about is my book on Thomas Merton, who also has been a very important part of my life and my writing.
Yeah, so tell us a little bit about how that came about.
When I was in high school, I was questioning a lot of what I had been taught and where and where I was headed and where I was going. I was arguing with my parents. I was arguing with my pastor. I was moving from being a conservative to a progressive is one way to express it. But I also was moving from being an evangelical Protestant towards being a Catholic. And part of that discovery and learning and growth for me was to discover Thomas Merton. And where I first discovered him, it's actually a great sort of ecumenical kind of example of how life sometimes works. So at the time I was a Baptist, and my pastor was not supportive of the idea that when I registered for selective service that I wanted to register as a conscientious objector. My pastor told me that that was not acceptable, and I knew that there were Christians who did this, even though I had no one to give me good advice. And so someone pointed me towards a nearby Mennonite counseling center. So I went to see the director at this Mennonite counseling center, which is in Lombard, Illinois. It's called the Mennonite Peace Center. And I sat with the director, and he told me that absolutely there's a long tradition for this. And he educated me on what it meant to be a CO, and I was grateful. And one of the things he did that day was that he put into my hands the first Thomas Merton book that I ever read, called The Nonviolent Alternative. So I came to Merton through his peace and justice writings, which is not how I think most people come to Merton. I mean, maybe they did in the 60s, but I don't think it's how people come to Merton today. Usually it's through The Seventh Story Mountain or New Seeds of Contemplation or books like that. But for me, that's how it began. And that then became a lifetime of being influenced by Merton. And it included a few years later, I seriously considered a monastic vocation. So Merton has been very important in my life.
Wow. But this is the first Merton book you've written, is that correct?
It's the first Merton book I've written. I think Merton has appeared in a lot of things I've written over the last 20 years, but and I edited 2 books of Merton's lectures for Liturgical Press. One of them has been used quite widely and translated into several languages. It's called A Course in Christian Mysticism, and it's talks that Merton gave to the monks at Gethsemane. So I've been involved in some Merton projects. I also edited a book for Ave Maria Press several years ago called What I Am Living For, with a variety of contributors, including Father Jim Martin and Sue Monk Kidd and others, talking about Merton in very short form. But this is the first time I've written sort of my own book about Merton. I wanted to write an introduction to him. There have been many of them written, but I wanted to sort of try to do it in a new way. Cool.
Well, very glad you did. What types of research did you do to create the book?
I read widely, and I reread all the Merton books that I'd read in the past, and I spent time with the correspondence and with the journals, and I was very familiar with the secondary literature because of all these other projects that I've done over the years. So I just delved deep for a year and a half.
But I guess, relative to maybe some other books or other areas, you already knew so much about Merton. Yeah. You already read so much and did so much work in that area that it was probably easier than average for you to create this.
Well, it was easier in the sense that I could just turn around to my shelves and find most of the stuff that I needed. I mean, it was easier in that sense. There are other projects that I've written. I wrote a book years ago called Inventing Hell, which is a really fun book where I demonstrate that the 21st understanding of hell that you might hear from pulpits where pastors like to preach about hell, that none of that really comes from the Bible, and showing where it comes from throughout throughout the ancient world and the Middle Ages. And it was a lot of fun to do, but I remember after signing the contract and agreeing to do it and sitting down thinking to myself, what in the world have I gotten myself into? Because it involved so much work and research, and I did not have the stuff on my shelves that I needed. So there are projects that are much more labor intensive, but the Merton one was not that for me.
Good. So there's another recent Thomas Merton book that came out from another one of my author friends, Sophronia Scott.
Yes, I read it. It's a very good book.
Yeah, I mean, Sophronia is great. And so, I enjoyed that book quite a bit too. But how would you say that your books differ?
Oh, well, my book is more basic. My book is, I mean, the title is An Introduction to Thomas Merton. My book is meant to be an introduction to Thomas Merton for a 21st century person who is probably unmoored, or often anyway, unmoored from religion, from church attendance or religion generally. So, the old-fashioned, what we used to call the spiritual seeker. I don't know, do we still use that phrase? But the nun, the person
Right.
who has left religious participation, but who still is sometimes even more passionately involved in spiritual quest. So I wanted to write the book for that person. And so I tell the story of his life. I hit all the major themes of what his spiritual teachings were about. I talk about his own spiritual practice. I don't flinch at criticizing him on occasion, because he was a man who was full of contradictions. He was a monk who was kind of full of contradictions. And sometimes I think teasing those out and understanding those is a way to understand him truly. And it's also a way to even love him and his work more sometimes. So my book does that, and it does it in fairly short form. My book's actually a little bit shorter than Sophronia's too. I mean, my book's only 160 pages. Hers is a bit longer, and hers is a lot about her own experience with Merton.
Right.
My book really is not about me. Well, every book is about the author as well, but my book does not try to be about me. It really just tries to be an introduction to Thomas Merton.
Very cool. So you mentioned one additional book, that you have coming out soon. Are there any other future books that you can talk about?
Well, the one other thing I'll talk about, I suppose, is that the last volume in a children's series that I have loved doing for a few years now is coming out in a little while also. It's a series called The Pope's Cat.
Oh, right.
It's a very fun fiction series for kids, mostly Catholic kids, to open up the Vatican, the Swiss Guard, St. Peter's Basilica, the life of a pope and what popes do. I had this idea several years ago looking at the refrigerator magnet of Pope Francis in my kitchen and thinking to myself, kids probably don't have any idea what a pope actually does. They just see him smiling and waving. So I wanted to create this series, and so I did it by having the Pope go out walking one morning on the Via della Consiglione early in the morning before the sunrise, as if a Pope could ever do that by himself, and discovering a stray cat on the street and tucking it inside his cassock and bringing it inside the Vatican, so that through the cat, Margaret's eyes, we get to find out what popes do. So anyway, the last book, the fifth book in that series, is coming out several months from now. And these are all illustrated by a man named Roy de Leon, who's incredibly talented.
Very cool. We'll be excited about that one too. So let's talk a little bit more about Paraclete. The kinds of books you publish, how many books per year, all those kinds of things.
Sure. So Paraclete Press has been around for 45 years, located on Cape Cod in Massachusetts. We are an ecumenical press. We publish, what's special about Paraclete is that we publish the widest range possible of Christian expression in spirituality, mostly in spirituality, books on spiritual practice. And so we publish Protestants, we publish evangelicals, we publish mainline, we publish Orthodox, books from the Eastern Church, and we publish Catholics. There are some people who think of us as a Catholic press because, we've done a lot of best-selling books by Catholic authors, but we're not strictly speaking a Catholic press. We're really a widely ecumenical press. And as I sometimes like to say, every now and then I get to do a Jewish book too. So maybe every couple of years I get to do a book in Jewish spirituality, because there's a way in which Jewish spirituality can also very much complement Christian expression and understanding. So that's what Paraclete does. And we do 30, I always say 35. I haven't counted recently, but we do about 35 books a year, broken up into spring and fall seasons. We publish poetry. We're probably the most renowned currently publisher of literary poetry from a spiritual perspective, publishing 5-6 volumes a year in poetry. We're also starting to do fiction again. We had stopped for a few years, and we're now coming back into that. But then most of what we do is nonfiction, adult spirituality.
Sure. So you are kind of one of the unique publishers from many different perspectives, as you said, the breadth, theologically, and also the poetry aspect of it. There aren't very many publishing houses, it seems, these days that are doing that.
Yeah, we have found a way to do it well, and we have a passion for it. Our staff has a passion for it. I find that a publisher can't really pull something like that off unless the team, the staff, is really behind it and gets involved in the content with a real passion. And we've done that for poetry over the years, and I think it shows.
Now, these multi-author books, mostly the poetry books, or single author?
No, single author.
Okay.
Yep. Lucy Shaw, for instance, is probably
sure.
Lucy Shaw, Scott Cairns are probably our two best known poets.
Sure.
We've most of their work in recent years.
Okay, awesome. So just to close off, what kind of advice do you have for its aspiring writers? People are just kind of new to all of this.
Work hard every day. Don't let the loneliness of the writing occupation get you down. It hits you frequently, and you have to keep at it, and you have to make friends and maintain healthy relationships with other writers who can sometimes cheer you along, sometimes give you good advice. In fact, having friends who will give you good advice is important. I often receive proposals from authors, and you can tell that they've never had a real critical eye on their work because they've probably only shown it to people who are disposed to tell them that everything they do is terrific.
Sure.
You got to have critical friends too. You got to have friends who are willing and able to be critical. It's kind of like when we grieve, we need people around us who are willing to let us grieve and not just tell us to feel better. Similarly, I think when you're a writer, you got to have friends around you who are willing to point out what you could do better and to challenge you and not just tell you to feel better and that it's all good. So I don't know, those are some of the kinds of things that I often am thinking about when I'm looking at proposals, which I do every day.
Well, I've had a lot of author friends say the same thing about, having friends, other skilled author friends who are willing to really tell you what they think.
Yes. Well, and the last thing I would say write about what you're passionate about. Here's an insight from an editor. I am very rarely interested in telling a writer what I want them to write about. I think a lot of writers sort of grow up in the field thinking that an editor is going to call them up and say, I like you and I'd like you to write about this. That does happen occasionally, but I am wary of doing that because over the years, there have been many occasions when I've done that and the project never gels or it never comes to fruition or it turns out not to be very good because essentially they're writing a book for someone else. I want to know what you can't sit still over. I mean, I want to see the book that you had to write because it's bursting out of you. That's what an editor wants to see.
I can totally see why that makes sense. If nothing else, I mean, just the amount of time and work and effort, perseverance and diligence are required to write a book. You've got to have that kind of passion to keep, at it and make it happen.
Yes. And the reader has to feel it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Jon, thanks so much for joining us. Congratulations on the new book. Congratulations on all the amazing work that you've done. I'm really glad to be able to talk with you about it today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me here, Brian.